I cried alone at night with an earache, and all I wanted was my mother, her hug, a refuge to feel safe, but she abandoned me.
That phrase shattered my heart. This is Ethan's story, but let's rewind a bit to better understand how it all began. Life in the small Chicago apartment mirrored Sarah and Michael's daily struggles. They lived in a modest neighborhood, surrounded by old buildings and bustling streets. The apartment was simple but cozy, with walls adorned by Ethan's childish drawings, as he was just beginning to grasp how to hold a pencil. Despite financial hardships, the family did their best to find moments of joy together. Sarah loved making pancakes on Sundays, while Michael took Ethan to the park to play with their dog. Yet, these brief glimpses of happiness couldn't mask the growing tension. Michael, once a caring and devoted man, was losing himself to alcohol. He began coming home late, stumbling as Sarah waited up for him, her eyes heavy from sleepless nights. The fights became frequent, with harsh words exchanged even in Ethan's presence. Though young, Ethan sensed something was wrong. He clung to his toys, listening to the muffled arguments coming from the other room. Ethan loved his father but could see how much he was changing. Some days, Michael would try to make up for his absences, spending entire afternoons playing with his son. Other times, he withdrew to the couch, lost in thought, a bottle by his side. Sarah, meanwhile, struggled to keep the household running, but the weight of responsibilities was slowly crushing her. The atmosphere in the apartment shifted. Where there had once been laughter and familial warmth, silence now prevailed, broken only by occasional arguments. Ethan, innocent and hopeful, did his best to bring his parents together, showing them his drawings or asking them to tell stories together. But the growing distance between Sarah and Michael felt irreparable. Sarah spent weeks contemplating a decision that would change all their lives. Sitting at the kitchen table, her trembling hands clutching a mug of cold coffee, she thought about the future. The constant fights and Michael's emotional instability had drained her energy and hope. She loved her son with all her heart, but felt that staying in this situation would mean failing to give him what he truly deserved: a safe, stable, and loving home. One night, after yet another heated argument, Sarah finally found the courage to voice what she had been holding inside. Michael was slumped on the couch, his gaze vacant, a nearly empty bottle at his side. "Michael, I can't live like this anymore," she began, her voice shaking. He looked up, startled and defensive. "What do you mean, Sarah?" She took a deep breath before continuing. "I'm leaving. I'm going to London. My sister has offered to help me. I need a fresh start." Sarah's words hit Michael like a punch to the gut. He tried to argue, but deep down he knew she had every reason to leave. The hardest blow came when Sarah confessed she couldn't take Ethan with her. "I'm not in a position to care for him right now. Everything there is uncertain. He needs an environment I can't provide." Michael, already grappling with his inability to hold things together, fell silent. He knew Sarah was right, but the pain of hearing those words was unbearable. The morning Sarah left, Ethan, with his big, curious eyes, watched everything without fully understanding what was happening. He saw his mother close her suitcase and kneel down in front of him. "I'm going to miss you so much, my love," she said, kissing his forehead. "But I promise I'll come back for you someday." Ethan didn't say a word. He simply clutched the teddy bear she had given him the night before. Michael, standing by the door, watched the scene with a hardened face and teary eyes. When Sarah walked out the door, it felt as though the small apartment in Chicago had become even smaller and emptier. After the door closed, Ethan turned to his father, looking for answers. Michael, unable to find the words, picked him up. He knew he was facing the greatest challenge of his life: to be the father Ethan needed, even while he himself felt utterly broken inside. Michael tried to establish a routine for himself and Ethan after Sarah's departure, but he quickly realized the task was far harder than he had imagined. Mornings began as a race against the clock. Michael had to make breakfast, get Ethan dressed, and drop him off at kindergarten before heading to work. But the emotional and physical toll rapidly piled up. With no help or support network, his insecurity as a parent only deepened his anxiety. At first, he gave it his all. He took Ethan to the park after work, tried to help him with simple educational games, and read bedtime stories to him, even when exhaustion weighed heavily on him. But as days turned into weeks, the fatigue began to overtake him. The bottle of whiskey Michael kept hidden became his constant companion after he put Ethan to bed. He tried to justify it to himself, saying it was just a way to cope with the stress, but slowly alcohol regained control over his life. With no one to watch Ethan, Michael started taking him along to the local bar. Initially, he tried to limit these visits, but they soon became routine. Ethan, perched on a high stool, would watch his father drink, soaking in the bar's somber atmosphere. The patrons, some friendly and others indifferent, occasionally joked with the boy, offering him candies or coins to buy a soda. Michael felt torn apart. He loved his son more than anything, but he knew deep down this wasn't the life Ethan deserved. Good days became increasingly rare. There was an afternoon when Michael took Ethan to a lake on the outskirts of the city. They laughed together, skipping stones across the water, and Ethan clung tightly to his father's hand, as if sensing he might slip away. But moments like that were overshadowed by the nights when Michael drank until late, leaving Ethan to fall asleep on a nearby bench. Michael remained caught between his unconditional love for his son and his inability to confront his own demons. One night, as Ethan played with a toy car on the bar table, Michael looked at him and felt an overwhelming wave of guilt. He knew he was failing. Ethan deserved so much more than he could offer at that moment. The image of Sarah leaving and the promise to take care of the boy lingered constantly in his mind, like a shadow he couldn't shake. Margaret, Michael's mother, had always had a sixth sense when it came to her family. Though she didn't live nearby, she called her son regularly, and over the past few months, his evasive answers and the exhaustion in his voice had made her uneasy. When she heard a rumor from a neighborhood acquaintance about Michael frequently showing up at bars with Ethan, she decided to act. Without warning, she took a bus to Chicago and arrived at her son's apartment on a cold November morning. When Michael opened the door and saw Margaret standing there, he felt a mix of relief and shame. The apartment was a mess, with clothes scattered on the floor and toys piled in the corner. Ethan, barefoot, sat on the couch watching cartoons, his hair unkempt and his expression tired. Margaret didn't need to say a word. Her look said it all. She hugged Ethan tightly and then sat down at the table with Michael, determined to have an honest conversation. "Michael, I know you're trying. I know you love Ethan more than anything, but this isn't working. Look at him, look at yourself. You both need help." Michael tried to protest, but his mother's trembling voice cut him off. "You're my son, and I love you, but I can't stand by and watch you both sink any further. Let me take care of Ethan, at least for a while. Give yourself a chance to get better." At first, Michael resisted. He felt that handing Ethan over would be admitting failure as a father. But as he looked at his son, now quietly playing on the floor with Lego pieces, he realized Margaret was right. He couldn't keep going like this. Michael's heart was in pieces, but he knew he had to do what was best for his son. The next morning, Margaret packed a small suitcase with Ethan's clothes and took him to her home in the outskirts of Milwaukee. The car ride was quiet. Ethan, not fully understanding the situation, stared out the window while clutching the teddy bear his mother had left behind. Margaret tried to hold back her tears, but she felt a sharp pang of pain seeing the confused look on her grandson's face. When they arrived at her modest home, Margaret knelt in front of Ethan. "This is your new home, sweetheart. We're going to make this a happy place for you." Ethan nodded, but his gaze was distant. Margaret knew the road ahead would be challenging, but she was determined to give her grandson the love and stability he so desperately needed. Margaret adjusted her routine to accommodate Ethan in her small yet cozy home, where she had lived for over 20 years. The house was simple, with walls decorated by faded family photos and handmade curtains. For Ethan, everything felt new and a bit strange. He missed his father, even though his memories of their time together were tangled with moments of sadness. Still, Margaret did everything she could to make him feel loved and secure. Every morning, Margaret woke up before dawn. She prepared a strong cup of coffee for herself and a bowl of cereal for Ethan. Then she walked him to school, an old building just a few blocks from her home. She always held his hand as they walked, as if trying to convey, through that simple touch, the sense of security she knew he needed. After dropping him off at school, Margaret headed to her job as a cleaner in a large commercial building in downtown Milwaukee. The work was tiring, but she did it without complaint, knowing it was for Ethan's well-being. Ethan, in turn, slowly began adjusting to his new life. He spent afternoons alone in the small house while Margaret was still at work. Though she tried her best to get home early, her schedule didn't always allow it. Ethan filled his time drawing, something he loved, but often found himself gazing out the window, waiting for the familiar figure of his grandmother to round the corner. When she finally arrived, her hands worn from work and her face lined with fatigue, she always greeted him with a warm smile and asked about his day. Despite Margaret's efforts to fill the void left by his parents with all the love she could offer, there were gaps she simply couldn't close. Ethan often cried softly at night, clutching his teddy bear, imagining what it would be like to be held by his mother again. He rarely talked about it, but Margaret knew. One evening, as she was preparing dinner, she heard his quiet sobs coming from his room. She went in and found him curled up under the blankets, his eyes red. Sitting down beside him, she ran her hand gently through his hair. "I know you miss her, my love," she said softly, "and it's okay to feel that way. But please remember, I'm here. I'll always be here." Ethan looked up at her, his eyes filled with tears but also with something new: gratitude. He knew his grandmother did more for him than he could fully understand at his age. Even without having the answers or the presence of his parents, he began to find comfort in Margaret's unconditional love. Sarah's absence was a void Ethan felt most deeply at night. When silence enveloped the house and Margaret had fallen asleep after a long day's work, he would curl up in his bed with his teddy bear. It was always in those quiet hours that memories of his mother resurfaced. Her floral perfume, the way she held him in her arms, and how she sang lullabies to him. He would take out the old photo he kept hidden in a drawer, the only image he had of her. It had been taken on a sunny day at the park. Sarah was smiling, holding baby Ethan in her arms. He ran his fingers over the worn photograph, as if the touch alone could bring back the feeling of being close to her. Margaret noticed the longing that consumed Ethan, even though he rarely spoke of his mother. One day, while tidying his room, she found the photo tucked away in the drawer. She said nothing at the time, but later that evening, as Ethan sat drawing at the kitchen table, she joined him. "I saw the photo you keep, sweetheart," she said gently. Ethan stopped drawing, his eyes fixed on the paper, as if afraid she might scold him. But Margaret simply placed her hand over his. "She's your mother. It's natural to want to remember her, and I would never try to replace what she means to you." Ethan looked at his grandmother, surprised, as tears began to stream down his face. "I just wish she would come back," he confessed, his voice trembling. Margaret pulled him into a tight hug. "I know, my love. I know, and I wish I could bring her back for you. But until then, I'll do everything in my power to give you the best I can." Even with Margaret's evident love, there were nights when nothing seemed to fill the void Sarah had left behind. Ethan would cry softly, clutching his pillow as if it were his mother's embrace. Sometimes he dreamed she had returned, holding him and telling him everything would be okay. But every time he woke, the house remained quiet, and Margaret was the only constant in his life. That realization made him love her even more, but it also brought the painful awareness that the past couldn't be undone. Over time, Ethan began to understand that, Though he missed his mother, there was something undeniable about his grandmother. She was there, always, and even though he didn't express it in words, he silently promised himself that one day he would find a way to repay all the effort and love she had given him. The years crept by, and Ethan began to see more clearly the sacrifices Margaret made for him. Her hard work left visible marks. Her hands grew rough, her steps slower, and the nights seemed to rob her of any true rest. Yet she never complained. Even after an exhausting day, she always found time to ask Ethan about his day, listen to his stories, and admire his drawings, which were becoming more detailed and full of life. One evening, as Margaret cooked, Ethan silently watched her. Steam rose from the pot, framing her tired but serene face. In that moment, he realized he wanted more than just to receive her love. He wanted to give it back. He wanted to become someone she could be proud of, someone who made all her sacrifices worthwhile. That thought planted itself in his heart, growing into a silent promise. He didn't yet know how he would fulfill it, but he knew he would do everything in his power to honor all that Margaret had done for him. At school, Ethan began trying harder. He wasn't the brightest student, but he put effort into his assignments, especially in art, where he could express his feelings. He drew scenes of his life with Margaret. The simple house, their moments together in the kitchen, their walks to the park. One day, his teacher called him aside after class. "Your drawing is beautiful, Ethan. It looks like there's a lot of love in it." He smiled shyly, but those words made him feel like he was on the right path. Still, there were days when things felt hard. Ethan was just a child, and like any child, he sometimes felt frustrated or overwhelmed. But in those moments, he would look at Margaret, who never gave up, and he found strength. Once, as he watched her fixing a broken chair with her calloused hands, he asked, "Don't you ever get tired, Grandma?" Margaret paused and smiled. "Of course I do, my dear. But when it's for someone you love, it's worth it." Those words stayed with him, etched in his mind. Ethan's promise became a kind of anchor for him. Whenever he missed his mother or thought about the difficult days with his father, he returned to that inner resolve. No matter what happened, he would do everything he could to make Margaret proud. And though he was still young, something shifted in his gaze. He began to carry a determination he didn't even know he had. Adolescence arrived like an unexpected storm, bringing changes Ethan didn't know how to handle. Margaret did her best to guide him, but her exhausting work and the generational gap made some conversations difficult. By the time Ethan turned 15, he began feeling the weight of expectations and a longing to be part of something bigger than his simple routine. It was during this time that he met a group of peers who quickly embraced him. At first, they seemed friendly and carefree, exactly the kind of companionship Ethan craved. But it didn't take long for it to become clear that their idea of fun involved parties, drinking, and long nights away from adult supervision. Margaret noticed the changes almost immediately. Ethan started coming home later, his eyes always tired, and his behavior became more reserved. She tried talking to him, but Ethan, still grappling with the pain of his parents' absence, felt torn between the freedom he found with his friends and the guilt of disappointing his grandmother. One night, after he stumbled through the door, the smell of alcohol clinging to his clothes, Margaret sat him down in the kitchen. "Ethan, what's going on? This isn't you. I know you, my dear. Please talk to me." But Ethan simply lowered his head, unable to find the words. At school, things began to unravel. The parties and bad influences started to take a toll on his academic performance. He turned in half-completed assignments, arrived late to class, and was eventually called to the principal's office. Margaret was informed, and the news was devastating. When she came home that day, the silence was deafening. Ethan knew he had let down the one person who had always been there for him. Even so, Margaret didn't give up. Instead of confronting him with anger, she chose to show Ethan that she still believed in him. One day, she left a note on the table, next to a plate of his favorite cookies. "I will always love you, Ethan." I know you can be so much more than this. I'm here to help you find your way." Her words touched something deep within him, but at that moment, the pull of his friends was still too strong. Despite everything, Ethan began to feel that the life he was leading was unsustainable. He knew he was hurting Margaret and, even worse, straying from the person he wanted to become. There were nights when he stared at the ceiling in his room, remembering the promise he had made years ago. He wanted to change but didn't yet know how to find the strength to do it. The night everything changed started like so many others. Ethan told Margaret he was going to a friend's house to study, but she knew that was unlikely. She felt a growing unease, something that made her glance out the window repeatedly, hoping for any sign of her grandson. Meanwhile, Ethan was at a party that had spiraled out of control. Laughter, loud music, and the stench of alcohol filled the air. But to him, everything felt like a blur. He drank more than usual, trying to drown the guilt that had been building inside him. As he decided to head home, the weight of his actions began to settle heavily on him. Stumbling through the empty streets, he finally reached the front door but couldn't find his keys in his pocket. The cold of the early morning crept in, but he was too exhausted to keep trying. He sank to the ground, leaning against the door, and fell asleep right there, his face marked by regret and his body surrendered to fatigue. The next morning, Margaret woke up early, as she always did. When she opened the door to leave for work, her heart stopped for a moment. There was Ethan, curled up on the ground, his clothes rumpled, his eyes swollen. The relief of seeing him alive was quickly replaced by a deep sadness. She crouched down, gently touching his shoulder. "Ethan, my dear, let's get you inside," she said, her voice trembling. He opened his eyes slowly, confused and ashamed, but let her help him inside. Margaret guided him to the sofa and covered him with a blanket. Before leaving for work, she prepared a cup of coffee and placed it next to him, along with another note. "You are my greatest joy, Ethan, but I don't know how to help you if you won't help yourself. Please, think about what you're doing to yourself." When Ethan finally woke and saw the note, something inside him shifted. He remembered Margaret's face that morning, her eyes shining with tears as she tried to stay strong. He realized that it wasn't just him who was suffering. His choices were weighing heavily on her too. His heart tightened as he thought back to the promise he had made to himself to be someone she could be proud of. Now, sitting in the silent living room, he began to wonder how he could turn his life around. Ethan spent the rest of the day sitting on the sofa, holding Margaret's note in his hands. He read and reread the words, each one hitting him like a blow. In that silence, his mind wandered back to the previous night, the helplessness he'd felt as he fell asleep on the doorstep, and the look of disappointment in his grandmother's eyes that morning. For the first time in a long while, he clearly saw the impact of his actions. As night fell, Margaret returned home. At first, she said nothing, but her eyes searched for some sign of change in Ethan. He watched as she set her bag on the floor and untied the scarf she wore in her hair. After a long day of work, she looked even smaller and more fragile than usual. The sight filled him with a crushing guilt. He knew she had carried the weight of raising him alone and that his rebelliousness was only making things harder. Finally, Ethan found the courage to speak. "Grandma," he began, his voice hoarse and hesitant, "I'm sorry for everything." Margaret stopped and turned to him. She didn't respond right away but walked over to the sofa and sat down beside him. "Ethan," she said softly, taking his hand in hers, "what matters is what you do from here on out. It's not enough to just feel sorry. You have to take action." Those words echoed in Ethan's mind. He knew he needed to change, but he also knew it would take effort and sacrifice. In the days that followed, he started making small changes. He stopped spending time with the friends who had been a negative influence and began helping Margaret with household chores. He started thinking about what he wanted for the future and, most importantly, what he needed to do to honor the promise he had made to himself years ago. But change wasn't easy. Ethan faced days when the temptation to return to his old habits was strong. He struggled with feelings of inadequacy and doubts about whether he could truly redeem himself. In those moments, he reminded himself of Margaret's words, "What matters is what you do from here on out." That phrase became a kind of mantra for him, something that pushed him to keep trying, even when it felt difficult. One evening, as he sat at the kitchen table with Margaret, Ethan looked at her and said firmly, "I want to change, Grandma. I want to be someone you're proud of." Margaret smiled, and there was a light in her eyes that Ethan hadn't seen in a long time. "I'm already proud of you, Ethan. Just the fact that you're trying makes you everything to me." With his decision to change firmly in mind, Ethan began to reorganize his life. He knew he needed a new purpose, something that would pull him away from his past and closer to the future he envisioned. One day, during a walk through the neighborhood, he met Emily. She was volunteering at a community center near Ethan's school, handing out flyers about educational programs. Her smile was warm, and her genuine approach immediately caught his attention. When Emily handed him a flyer, she noticed his curious gaze. "We're helping people who want to find new opportunities," she said enthusiastically. Ethan thanked her but didn't say much. Still, something about that brief interaction stuck in his mind. The next day, he walked past the community center and, after some hesitation, decided to go inside. Emily was there organizing papers at a table. "Ethan, right?" she asked, recognizing him immediately. He nodded with a shy smile, and the two began to talk. Ethan shared bits of his story with Emily, who listened attentively without judgment. He talked about his grandmother, his struggles, and his desire to change. Emily, moved by his honesty, encouraged him to join one of the personal development programs offered by the center. She also mentioned that there were scholarships available for young people who wanted to go back to school. For the first time in years, Ethan felt a real possibility of transforming his life. Over the weeks, Ethan began attending the community center regularly. He participated in lectures, workshops, and mentoring sessions. Emily was always nearby, encouraging him and showing that she believed in him. Their friendship blossomed, and Ethan started to trust her as an ally on his journey. During one of their conversations, Emily asked, "Have you ever thought about going to college?" Ethan hesitated. The idea seemed distant, almost impossible. "I don't know if I'm good enough for that," he replied. Emily smiled, determined. "Everyone has potential, Ethan. You just have to believe in yourself and work for it." Inspired by Emily's words, Ethan began researching courses that piqued his interest. After much thought, he decided he wanted to study information technology. The choice stemmed from his love of building and creating things, a passion he had always expressed through his drawings and small projects. With Emily's help and support from the community center, he applied to a community college and secured a partial scholarship. The day he received his acceptance letter, he rushed home to show Margaret. "I got in, Grandma," he exclaimed, his eyes shining with excitement. Margaret hugged him tightly, overcome with emotion. "I always knew you could do it, Ethan. I'm so proud of you." Starting community college was like opening a new door for Ethan, but the journey wasn't easy. On his first day, he felt a mix of excitement and insecurity as he walked through the hallways filled with unfamiliar faces. He had been away from school for so long that he feared he might not keep up. Yet, with Emily's unwavering support and Margaret's constant encouragement, Ethan resolved to tackle the challenge head-on. The first few months tested his endurance. He had to juggle classes with a part-time job he had landed as an assistant at an electronics store. The job was straightforward but left him exhausted, especially on nights when he stayed up late reviewing programming and technology concepts. At times, the thought of giving up crept into his mind, but he always remembered his grandmother and Emily's words. Everyone has potential. Margaret played her part in keeping him motivated. She prepared meals for him to take to college and often surprised him with encouraging notes hidden in his backpack. "Remember, today's effort builds tomorrow's future," read one of them. These simple, love-filled gestures kept Ethan going on his toughest days. A significant milestone came when Ethan submitted his first major technology project, a basic app designed to organize daily tasks. He spent countless nights working on the project, often asking Emily to review his ideas. When he presented the app in class, he received praise from both his professor and his peers, something he had never experienced before. It was a transformative moment, one that made him realize he truly could achieve his goals. Throughout the course, Ethan began building a circle of friends who shared his interests. Unlike the friends from his past, these new companions encouraged him to study and explore his potential. For the first time, Ethan felt like he was part of something greater, as though he was finally finding his place in the world. That feeling was reinforced every time he returned home and saw the pride in Margaret's eyes. During a dinner conversation, Margaret asked, "Are you happy, Ethan?" He paused for a moment to think before responding. "I still have a lot to do, Grandma, but yes, I am. For the first time, I feel like I'm on the right path." Margaret smiled, her eyes glistening with emotion, and said, "I always knew you'd get there. You have a strong heart and a brilliant mind." After 2 years of hard work at the community college, Ethan's efforts began to pay off. On the day of his graduation, the auditorium was packed with students and their families, but Ethan could only focus on Margaret, who was sitting in the front row. She wore her best dress, a gift from Ethan, and clutched a small handkerchief to catch the tears that refused to stay away. When his name was called, she stood and clapped with a joy that seemed to light up the entire room. As Ethan walked across the stage to receive his diploma, a wave of emotions washed over him. He looked at Margaret and smiled, knowing that this moment was as much hers as it was his. After the ceremony, they hugged tightly. "I knew you could do it, Ethan," Margaret said, her voice trembling. "This is just the beginning." He returned the hug, feeling more determined than ever to keep forging the path he had chosen. With diploma in hand, Ethan decided it was time to find a job in the tech field. First, it wasn't easy. He spent weeks sending out resumes and attending interviews, facing rejections that tested his patience and self-confidence. But Ethan refused to give up. With Emily's constant support, she helped him refine his cover letters and practice for interviews. He finally received an offer from a promising company in Seattle. Moving to Seattle was a big step, both for Ethan and Margaret. He knew leaving his grandmother behind would be hard, but he promised to visit often and keep her updated on everything. In his new city, Ethan threw himself into his work, impressing his supervisors with his work ethic and creativity. He started as a technical assistant but quickly stood out, earning larger responsibilities on important projects. One quiet evening, during a phone call with Margaret, Ethan shared the news of his first promotion. "Grandma, I'm now a systems analyst," he said, his voice brimming with excitement. Margaret laughed with joy on the other end of the line. "I knew you were destined for great things, my dear. I'm so proud of you." Though they were separated by hundreds of miles, Ethan felt her love as strongly as ever. That achievement was a significant milestone, but Ethan knew he couldn't stop there. He kept working hard, knowing that every step forward brought him closer to repaying everything Margaret had done for him. As his life in Seattle began to take shape, Ethan started building a solid future. He dedicated himself to his work with passion but never forgot his roots. Whenever he received his paycheck, he set aside a portion to send to Margaret, despite her protests. "Save it for yourself, Ethan," she would say over the phone. "You're just starting your life." But he always insisted, "Grandma, if I'm here today, it's because of you. This is the least I can do." At work, Ethan continued to shine. His ability to solve complex problems and his creativity in crafting technological solutions made him an indispensable part of the team. At a networking event, he was introduced to other professionals in the industry, and amidst conversations about careers and technology, he saw Emily again, this time in a different context. She had moved to Seattle to work for an organization focused on social impact through technology. Seeing Ethan there, confident and driven, moved her deeply. "I always knew you'd do something amazing," she said with a genuine smile. The two began spending more time together, not just talking about work, but also about their dreams and aspirations. Ethan opened his heart, sharing his plans to help Margaret and repay everything she had done for him. Emily, as always, encouraged him and helped him set goals. Over time, their friendship blossomed into something deeper. Ethan realized that with Emily, he had found not just a partner, but someone who had believed in him from the very beginning. At the same time, Ethan worked on an innovative project at his company, one that not only solved a significant technical problem but also generated cost savings and created a positive impact for clients. His initiative was recognized by the leadership, and he received another promotion, this time to project manager. When he shared the news with Margaret, she laughed and said, "You're getting so important that I might need to schedule an appointment to talk to you." Ethan laughed but reassured her that nothing was more important to him than his grandmother. With his new position and a more stable life, Ethan started making bigger plans. He wanted to buy a house where Margaret could live comfortably, close to him and Emily. During a call, he shared his vision with her. "Grandma, soon I'm going to bring you here. I don't want you to work another day in your life." Margaret, moved, simply replied, "My dear, it doesn't matter where I am. Just knowing that you're doing well brings peace to my heart." Over time, Ethan became a prominent figure in his company. His natural leadership and passion for his work inspired his team and caught the attention of the executives. After successfully implementing another impactful project, he was invited to attend strategic meetings where his innovative perspective became indispensable. It was during this time that an opportunity arose that would change his life: the offer to become a partner in the company. The invitation came during an unexpected meeting. The company's CEO called Ethan in privately and explained how his dedication and talent had transformed the team's dynamics. "You have something that can't be taught, Ethan: vision and courage. We want you to be part of this company's future as a partner." Ethan was speechless for a few moments, absorbing the magnitude of the offer. He thought of Margaret, of her lonely nights and the struggles that had brought him to this point. "I accept," he replied with conviction, already thinking about how he would share the news with her. When he called Margaret that evening, his voice was filled with emotion. "Grandma, they offered me a partnership in the company. I'm officially one of the owners." On the other end of the line, Margaret began to cry with joy. "I couldn't be prouder of you, Ethan. I always knew you had something special." He promised her that this achievement was as much hers as it was his, and that his next steps would be dedicated to providing her with the comfort she had always deserved. At the same time, Ethan began sharing his story at events and motivational talks. He spoke openly about his past, the abandonment, the struggles, and the strength he found in Margaret's love. His sincerity resonated deeply, especially with young people facing similar challenges. He used his platform not only to inspire but also to launch initiatives that provided educational opportunities and development programs for those in need. During one of these talks, he looked out into the audience and saw Emily. Her unwavering support had always been there, and in that moment, Ethan realized he wanted to share every moment of his life with her. A few weeks later, during an intimate dinner, he proposed. "Emily, you believed in me when I could barely believe in myself. I wouldn't be anything without you by my side. Will you marry me?" She said yes, tears in her eyes, and the couple began planning their future together. As Ethan organized his new life, he never forgot about Margaret. He made sure to include her in his plans, sending her photos of the house he was buying for her. "Grandma, it's big, with a garden where you can plant whatever you want, and there's a room just for you." Margaret laughed, touched. "All I need, Ethan. I already have you." The day Margaret moved into her new home was marked by a mix of nostalgia and joy. Ethan drove to Milwaukee to pick her up in the car he had bought himself. When he arrived at the old house, he found Margaret sitting in the living room with her small suitcase by her side. Though she knew this moment symbolized the beginning of something wonderful, she looked around with a wistful expression. "This house holds so many memories, Ethan," she said, smiling with tears in her eyes. He knelt beside her, holding her hands. "Now we'll make new memories, Grandma, and I promise they'll be even happier." When they arrived at the new house, Margaret was speechless. It was spacious, filled with light, and the garden Ethan had mentioned was even larger than she had imagined. He walked her through the house, showing her every room. When they reached the bedroom he had prepared just for her, Margaret found a shelf lined with photographs. Old pictures of Ethan as a child, of Sarah, and even of Michael, alongside recent photos of the life he was building. At the center of it all was a large framed quote she used to say, "When it's for love, it's worth it." Margaret couldn't hold back her tears. "Ethan, you didn't have to do all this for me." He hugged her and replied, "You gave me everything I needed, Grandma. Now it's my turn to take care of you." In that moment, she knew that every sacrifice, every exhausting night of work, and every tear had been worth it. In the months that followed, the house came alive with joy. Ethan and Emily were married in an intimate ceremony in the garden, with Margaret seated in a place of honor. During his vows, Ethan mentioned his grandmother, bringing tears to everyone's eyes. "You are the reason I'm here today," he said, looking at Margaret. "And I hope to be as strong an example for my children as you have been for me." As time went on, Ethan continued to thrive. He expanded his social initiatives, investing in programs to help young people overcome obstacles like the ones he had faced. Margaret, meanwhile, found a new joy in tending the garden, which became a sanctuary where she spent hours caring for flowers and herbs. Sometimes, Ethan would find her sitting in a chair under the shade of a tree, gazing at the house with a serene smile. "I'm proud of you, Ethan," she would say. "You're everything I could have ever dreamed of." When Ethan looked at his life, he felt immense gratitude. He knew the journey that had brought him to this point was filled with pain and challenges, but every moment had contributed to shaping him. And more than any material achievement, he understood that his greatest victory was the love and respect he had built with Margaret, Emily, and all the people who had believed in him. This is a true story. It took place in Brazil, but the names, country, and all personal details have been changed to protect the identities of those involved. This story is an inspiration, a tale of overcoming adversity, love, and discipline. It reminds us that while we cannot control what happened to us in the past, it is our responsibility to change our future. We are the ones who write our own story. If you enjoyed this story, please leave a comment to share your thoughts, subscribe to the channel, and stay tuned for more inspiring videos.